Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Diving Deeper. Pastor Dave and I are here with you again. And Pastor Dave, today marked the beginning of a new sermon series here at Lakeview. And we're taking a look at the history, but also, in a way, also looking towards the future of Methodism. And the way you've decided to do that is talk to us about foundational characters and influencers of Methodism. And this morning, we started with Susanna. So that leads me to my first question. I know it's Mother's Day, but why Susanna?
Why Susanna? Yeah, great question. So in a sense, we're starting with the prequel for what's going to happen here with this whole worship series of what we're doing and the people we're looking at, and we're going to be diving into really some of the spiritual DNA of Methodism, which goes back, many hundreds of years, goes back to the 1700s. But we're not doing that so much for a history lesson, really, so much as to look at who were these important influencers and what are we reclaiming from them that is still significant for us today as a church and helps to lead us forward. And Susanna was the mother of John and Charles Wesley, who were the founders of the Methodist movement in the 1700s. And she was a remarkable woman in just about every sense. And so it makes good sense on Mother's Day especially, as we give a nod to the significant women in our lives who we value and what they have meant to us. Here's a woman who, without her, it's unlikely we'd be here having this conversation today.
Right. One of the things that I guess I was really unaware of is just how she crossed boundaries and in many, I guess, aspects. When you look at her life, she was a courageous woman.
Yes.
And so, when we think of her, in the context, how do we see her efforts or how she lived her life or the steps she took in her faith as a mother?
Yes.
How do we see that translate to today? Or how do you think we would view what she did and how she lived her life today?
Yeah, I think of how she crossed boundaries, or she was pushed across boundaries or into completely uncomfortable situations in her life that she probably didn't plan on. I mean, her father was, as I mentioned in the sermon, was a priest in the Church of England who became what was known as a dissenter, which got him into all kinds of trouble with both the Church of England and the government in those times because they were so closely joined together. And so she grew up in a household where, her dad was making these gutsy and difficult moves that affected the whole family. I mean, they all suffered as a result of that. And but she grew up knowing and living with the value of following a religious conscience, that if God leads you to take a stand of conscience, you do that. There are tough consequences for that.
Sure.
But God does not abandon you in that. Certainly she had lots of difficulties in her marriage to her husband Samuel. They were living in this isolated community up in northern England, this village of Epworth. She was, although not formally educated, her parents had educated her extremely well. She was a very intelligent woman, very well read. And so, she would do things like I mentioned in the sermon, where she would hold a Sunday afternoon devotional when her husband was gone for long periods of time to these religious conferences. And women couldn't preach, women couldn't be leaders in the church in that day. But she had a hunger for herself and her family to have a substantive devotional time, a time to worship God. And the people around the village, they got wind of that. They were hungry for that too, and for her and for her leadership. And so she got into some trouble with her husband for that, but she argued her way out of it, saying, I can't turn these people away. They're hungry to know God.
Well, and that's an interesting point, or our turn of phrase is that hunger, that desire for God that she had. But I think that's one thing when we look for corollaries or how identifiers when you look to characters of the past.
Yes.
How are we alike? And I think that is probably the key thing that translates from Susanna's life into our own, is that hunger, that desire for God that we all experience in our individual walks of faith. And, I think like with Susanna, that leads God to move us in, I would say, fruitful directions
Yes.
in life. And so I guess one of the questions I would have for you, and having listened to the sermon, is where do you see God doing that for you
Yes.
in your life?
Yeah. In lots of places I would point to for that. And in some cases, kind of like where Susanna was at, it was in those circumstances where your life has put you in an uncomfortable place, or in a place where you could pivot towards a changing circumstance, a changing condition in your life. And there you find yourself moving that. When I was working in business as a management consultant many years ago, and loved working in all these different workplaces with very interesting work, but kept experiencing this desire to both know God and to share God more deeply, and realizing that was not going to work terribly well in the business context that I was in, because that's not what they were hiring me to do. And yet, looking at what people were grappling with in their business lives, the decisions and the pressures they were under, so on, that the need for faith was great. There was one instance where, in a set of recommendations for one manager who was under tremendous pressure, we did put in a list of recommendations: find time to go to a nearby chapel. We found one that was in downtown Los Angeles, and take some time to pray during the day as a way to re-anchor yourself. And I remember my boss saying, I don't think we have ever put that in a recommendation before, but for this fellow it fit. He was a person of had a deeply held faith in the Catholic tradition, and so we said, this is a tool for you to use for yourself. I've certainly found it in marriage and in the circumstances with my wife's health, at times when life has been very fragile and very precarious, and we're not sure what's going to be ahead. Mm-hmm. And those are times where I think maybe we're more attuned to God, and where God is calling us or helping us to see, here's a direction to move, or here's what I have for you, here's the help I have for you. And God has surprised me numerous times with that, with putting help into my life, and helping me to open my eyes to it, to see that sometimes benefited my wife, sometimes benefited me immensely, to get through those pressure cooker moments.
Sure, and that's a good point. I think, like I said, sometimes that leads you into a place in life where it is fruitful, where it reaps benefits. And, saying that, I don't mean that personally, or just for you. Like you said, it works for you, it works for your wife in those situations.
Yes.
And, God may have personally led you alone there, but it reaped dividends for you and your wife, which is one of the great ways that God works. One of the other things that stuck out to me is that Susanna seemed to be a woman of great determination, if you will. And, I'm curious how you think God worked through that or used that to help further her life's work, in a sense, in terms of being an example, or just outright, sharing her faith. And not only that, how did he use that to work through her? But, if you know of anybody, or if in your own personal example, that God has used that trait of determination to help bring things to pass in your life.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's an important both spiritual as well as personal quality and leadership quality, that sense of determination. We've all seen people who give up, or the circumstances of life, they get a lot of red lights, they're not sure how to keep going. And then there are folks who are like, they're going to go no matter what. They have a quality of perseverance. And we certainly see characters in Scripture who are able to do that. Moses had to learn how to do that, for the long haul, those 40 years plus in the wilderness, right? And, for Jesus and his ministry, for Paul and his missionary journeys and his building the early church, and so on, and faced, lots of personal hardships and leadership challenges along the way. And yet that quality of determination was significant. And God can use that and build on that, so that we're able to continue to be faithful to God, and to know that God is with us as we are moving through the most challenging times that life gives to us. Sometimes I think that quality of determination is just to help us to put one foot in front of the other to get through this day or this season that we're in. And other times, it may be that quality that God gives to us to help us us get through a tough issue, or a place of oppression, or a place where we're working on something in the community, or some issue in our world that is affecting a lot of people, and it's not going to be resolved easily. I mean, racism, one of those categories that comes to mind, one of those issues.
Sure.
It takes determination and perseverance to work on those kinds of issues, and God definitely works in those moments, works with us through those.
That's a great way of putting it. And it's definitely, like you said, I think it is, like most things in the Christian life, you have to do your part as well. And
Yes.
so I think when you lean into it, if that is something that either you were born with or you learn, that trait of determination, God then can maximize that. He sees if you to make that effort to get up
Yes.
and take that step, he honors that. And
Yes.
so, again, Pastor Dave, it was great talking about Susanna, learning about Susanna. I don't think that she is mentioned, a lot in modern Methodist sermons, and so it's good always to take a look back. And like I said at the beginning of this week's episode, not only are we taking a look back through this sermon series, but we are using that to look ahead as well as what we can learn and apply towards our future as we move forward here, and not only at Lakeview but the Methodist Church at large. So I want to thank you for joining us, and next week we'll be back to take a look at another character of the early Methodist faith.